Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for May 20th, 2021. Humanity is being tested now as never before. The issue before us is essentially the ultimate test. It's can we act in coherence with natural law, with God's laws, to bring universal justice, peace, freedom, the ability of people in every sovereign nation to develop their creative potentials for the good of all? Or will we instead be subordinated to an imperial order which insists that no nation can act on its own interests, but must subordinate those interests to an international unilateral regime? This is what George H.W. Bush meant by the New World Order, that no nation will have the right to pursue its own interests. Those interests will be determined for them by international consensus done by globalist corporations, especially central banks operating on behalf of private banks, insurance companies, the strategic metals cartels, raw material cartels, food cartels, big pharma, and so on. That our rights will be ceded, subordinated to the interests of those private entities. This is a total violation of the principles of the U.S. Constitution, which puts the general welfare ahead of any private individual rights. And yet what we're seeing in the name of the United States, as well as the countries of Western Europe, and directed largely from the City of London, is that no nation can go against the decisions of the unipolar world. And by unipolar world, it means the orders coming from the City of London, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and you can throw in Brussels and Frankfurt for that. Now, this is an untenable situation. Empires have always collapsed to the extent they've placed those kinds of unilateral demands ahead of the general welfare. The United States was created as a bedrock of opposition to that view, not just for the American people, but to be a light among nations. And we've lost that. We've lost that repeatedly, especially since 1971, or especially since the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, it's ironic that given all the anti-Russian propaganda that's put out by the British and the US press, that once again we're given a lesson in statecraft by Russian President Vladimir Putin. I'm going to read you some quotes from his presentation of his welcoming of ambassadors from 23 nations to Russia. And he talked about the threat, the threats we all face, the COVID pandemic, the deterioration of the system of strategic stability with arms control and international agreements, terrorism, the lack of information security, and general war. And here's what Putin said to them. He said, the epidemic has proved a real test for such universal human values as solidarity, mutual assistance, and love for humanity. Love for humanity, what is known as agape, the highest moral standard for Christian tradition, love of mankind. Putin is the one who's talking to us about that. He goes on and says, I repeat once again, it is possible to ensure peace, stability, and sustainable global development only through the efforts of the entire international community. We are calling for well-coordinated work by states, permanent members of the UN Security Council, and all concerned countries. As you know, Russia has recently celebrated the anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War that started 80 years ago, when the Nazis treacherously attacked our motherland. He went on to say, we are convinced that everything must be done to prevent the tragedy of World War II from repeating itself, so that its lessons will not be forgotten. All of us must cherish the priceless experience and spirit of allied relations during the struggle against common challenges and threats. We must remember the consequences of policies pandering to nationalism and xenophobia, and we must jointly elaborate a positive and unifying agenda to forge a more equitable and democratic multipolar order. We must ensure the well-being and prosperity of all human beings. Well said, President Putin. This goes against the unipolar order, what's now known as the rules-based order, that people like Tony Blinken is running around the world trying to enforce on behalf of the Biden administration. The rules-based order is the law of the jungle. Might makes right. And it's the basis of the downfall of every empire in the past, insisting that every nation bend to its knees to the dictates of the ruling world power. Now, this arrogance was on display again at the United Nations Security Council yesterday, where there was a discussion process of how to end the crisis in the Middle East, the Israeli aggression against the Palestinians. Yes, look, the Palestinians shouldn't be shooting missiles, but you're talking about incredible power of the Air Force of Israel, bombing and destroying thousands of homes, 18 hospitals, killing children. And Netanyahu, the lunatic representing the so-called Greater Israel policy, saying that he's not done yet, so he won't accept a ceasefire. And Biden, after days of saying it's Netanyahu's decision to make and we support him, finally said, well, we think you should slow it down or stop it. But at the UN Security Council yesterday, when a resolution came forward to call for a ceasefire, the U.S. opposed that resolution, saying, quote, it could interfere with the Biden administration's efforts to end the fighting. Well, the UN Security Council was calling for an end to the fighting. Why couldn't Biden join that call? Well, this is the arrogance of the unilateral world order, of the so-called rules-based order. And this is what is leading to the downfall of mankind. This unipolar order is also pushing the Great Reset, which would establish a global central bankers dictatorship, dictating to governments what they could spend money on, what money can be created, where it should go, and how the 1% of the wealthiest in the world will get the huge majority of this liquidity. And all the rest of us will get is higher taxes, inflation, losses of job, and loss of the future. This assertion of power by the economically wealthy and by the military force is unacceptable. The denial of sovereignty is unacceptable. We cannot give in to this global bankers' dictatorship. So what can we do? Well, the Schiller Institute and Helga LaRouche are taking an initiative at an event tomorrow, a conference in Rome on the world health situation. And what we're calling for is a medical infrastructure in every country, modern medical infrastructure. And this is part of an overall push for infrastructure, because modern medical infrastructure requires water, it requires electricity, it requires education, it requires transportation. We put out a report that talked about creating 1.5 billion new productive jobs, not green jobs, which are largely designed to enact slave labor policies while building a green financial bubble, but calling for all industrial nations to participate and join in this, what President Putin called solidarity for a common cause. This is in the tradition of the American system. And for those Americans who are sitting there saying, well, we have no power, what can we do? Download from the Schiller Institute site our call for this global development of a modern health system for every nation. Study it. Think about it. I'm sure almost every one of you can support it, because most of our viewers believe in the idea that man has a higher mission than accumulating wealth and personal security. And it's that higher mission, which Putin identified as love for humanity. That's the mission that we have to embrace now. Now, tomorrow is Friday. I'll be taking your questions. Send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com. I'll see you then.